27th, okay. Um, Tonight's discussion leader is Dr. Keith Gillard, who's been with the Medgar faculty for about 6, 7 years. During this time, he's obtained his doctorate. He is also a poet, um, and he is currently head of our basic skills. Am I correct? Uh, Professor Norman Loftus has returned to us after a while, after a short absence, I would say. He's on the English faculty here at the college. His expertise is in English and film history, if I'm correct. Now, the final panelist is Professor Safia Bendelli. She's the director of our Women's Center here at the college. Currently, they're having a series of programs that started in February, I believe, they're called the Black Women's History Series. They meet every Saturday through the month of March and part of April at the college over in the prep building. I believe it starts at 3 o'clock, 3 to 6 in the afternoons. Without further delay, I'd like to turn it over now to our discussion leader, Dr. Gillard.
Thanks, Yvonne, for doing my job for me. So I can make my introductory comments very brief. I know the difference between batting leadoff and hitting cleanup. So Professor Loftus is going to present first, and he will give us an overview of images of the Black family literature, and then Sophia will present. I'm sure it'll be scintillating. We'll deal with emerging images of the family. Oh, sure. At the end of the presentation, we'll be taking questions from the floor. That's crucial. Okay, Professor Loftus.
Actually, I think that the nature of my presentation is such that if you want to ask questions during the presentation, you should feel free to raise your hand, particularly students that I haven't, who are not my students, or people who are not otherwise familiar with my work. Those of you who have heard me lecture or are otherwise familiar with my book, From Barbarism to Decadence, will be familiar with my approach to culture in general and to Black aesthetics in particular. As you know, in that particular essay called Humiliated Consciousness, I talk about the humiliated consciousness as being the crucial point in determining Black aesthetics. The ideal of humiliated consciousness is a sense of consciousness about oneself as an object of shame. The example that I've used often to relate this is an example that shame can only exist before another person. If, for example, a woman is undressing in front of a window, she doesn't necessarily feel a sense of shame. But if her neighbor comes and tells her that he's had the experience of his life seeing her in the window, if she's sensitive in that way, she'll immediately feel a sense of shame and of blushing before the person who's seen her. The experience of Black literature isn't that much different. Before I go on, I just want to make sure that everybody understands, what do we mean by humiliated consciousness, so we can just, instead of assuming that you understand, so we can go on. What is, can you hear me back there? Okay. What does the term humiliated consciousness mean? Yes. Okay, good. Again, the components of this is there has to be you and there has to be another person in order for you to feel the sense of shame. The situation is not only applicable to individuals, but it's also applicable to groups of individuals and even nations. It is my belief that the history of the world is not the history of class struggle, but a history of humiliated consciousness, of which class struggle is simply one particular kind. Does everybody understand that? Karl Marx said, if you don't understand, you should raise your hand, because I realize that some of these ideas are, maybe complicated. So don't let me go on if you don't understand. Karl Marx said that what determines history is one class fighting against another class. What I'm saying is that people in history often have felt humiliated in a sense of shame, and that sense of shame has caused them to revolt against another class, and often even to enslave other people. Thank you. The writer and historian Stanley Elkins wrote a particular work called Slavery. And in this particular work, he talks about a series of shocks or traumas that shaped the black consciousness into what he describes, and in this particular work I should say that he's trying to justify the so-called Sambo image. What does that mean? When what was the Sambo image historically? Yes?
Invasion of the African continent, would represent only that of the Jews by the
Okay, well, actually, that's kind of the point that I'm coming to. But the Sambo image was a very special image, and that is that all blacks were lazy, shiftless, childlike, docile, loved watermelon, loved eating pancakes, and this was the image in which black people were regarded historically, up until this century, actually, up until well into this century. In this particular book, Elkins tries to justify this, but in doing so, he actually gives us some rather important information. What he says is that the black personality was shaped by a series of four shocks. And each of these shocks, well, let me ask you first of all, before we go into the particular shocks, what happens when you experience a trauma or something that is absolutely terrible and that you, it seems almost overwhelming for you? What is the response? I'm sorry, what? Yes, denial. And that means that the I that is experiencing this sense of shame is not the real I. That there's another particular person who is experiencing this particular shame. Now, the point that I'm about to make, so that it will be clear, and if you don't understand it, please tell me, is that what happened during the four traumas of black literature is that there was a separation in consciousness between remember that the people that were brought from West Africa were people who had a sense of worth. In some parts of Africa, they had the equivalent of a renaissance, and they had a sense of worth of themselves. So to be in this situation, to experiencing the shocks that we're going to describe, meant that they lived a particular kind of unreality. That, and in fact, there became, my thesis is there became kind of a humiliated self in which they were forced to project a particular self, which I call the humiliated self, in order to stay alive, essentially, because it is the image that their subjugator wanted, insisted on. But buried deep inside them was the original authentic self, or the real self. So that the real function of black literature, it seems to me, is the process by which the real self, or the authentic self, is recovered. Now let's hold that. Are there any questions about that? Because I realize it's a difficult concept. The students, I see students in my class, there would be more. It'd be a little easier for them to grasp that. Is there anybody that has any questions about that? That's difficult, but I would have to argue that that it's difficult for us to know anything about our personalities unless we look at ourselves in relationship to other people. And therefore, if that's the case, then shame and other emotions like that would be natural given our relationship with others. If we understand the point that I'm making here, that is that there were essentially two selves, a dual personality that the slave experienced, then it's time to talk about what those four shocks are. They were the shock of being captured, which was a humiliating and terrible experience. The shock of being sold on the auction block. The shock of the Middle Passage. What is the Middle Passage? Yes, the journey of Africa from Africa to the United States. Excuse me, and there was also the shock of seasoning in the islands. What is meant by seasoning in the islands? Well, essentially beating into submission. That in the West Indies, when they arrived in the West Indies, they were literally beaten into a certain kind of submission. One could say even beaten into humiliated consciousness, so that in the journey during the Middle Passage, a third of the people that were brought over died. During seasoning in the islands, another third died. And the numbers that we're talking about here, from 60 to 120 million people. Not 6 million, 120 million, which is a lot of people. So that what happened is that during prolonged periods of slavery, and being required just in order to survive to assume a particular posture, the humiliated self became kind of a permanent fixture in the black personality. That is a kind of dual personality. My contention is that the slave was aware of his other personality, but he was aware of it in such a way as to hide it from himself. That protecting his personality, the authentic self or his real self, was crucial if he were going to survive the experience of slavery. I want to stop here for just a second and ask, does anybody have any questions about this particular point before we go on? Okay. Everybody understands everybody understands what we mean by humiliated consciousness, by the fact that the slave experienced kind of a dual consciousness. Yes?
Is it possible these consciousness like that existed in before people are brought to the process capsule over in their own community?
Well, I would say it's certainly possible that the relationship of slavery is not unique, and slavery was not unique to America, first of all. That and let me just, because I did fail to mention it, that the experience that I'm talking about being humiliated in this way, of humiliated consciousness, can exist between a son and a father. It can exist between a male and a female. It can exist between, it does exist, it certainly existed in the Holocaust between Jews and Nazis. It exists between South Africans and blacks there. It is a universal reaction. And so to answer your question, I believe that it did. But we're talking specifically about how it shaped black consciousness and thereafter the black family, the sense of the black family. All right, let's move on then, if we grasp this point. Then the intellectual, black intellectual had as his task to recover the real self, or the authentic self, And there were a series of 4 phases in which this was done. In the first phase, the black writer or the black intellectual tries to prove that he is just as good as the person who is subjugating him. And in this particular respect, there's a work by a writer named Charles Chestnut, and the story is called The Wife of His Youth. And in this particular story, the main characters, there's a society called the Blue Veins, and the main character in this story says that, or the narrator says, that the Blue Veins, the Blue Bloods, which were very, very fair-skinned blacks, were as good as all but the very best Caucasians. What does that statement mean? I'm sorry, what? In what way? Yes, that these. Yeah, well, that's absolutely the case. What he's really saying is that there are Caucasians who are better than even the very best, if there's such a thing, black people. So that the, yes, go ahead.
On the other hand, it also says that only light-skinned or blue veins are good black. What's the matter with someone of a darker?
Absolutely. I should say that the focus of the story is that this man, that a black woman comes into his life, who's the wife of his slave wife. And he finally does accept her, which is the whole focus of the story.
There are Gladys
Excuse me.
Perez here. Gladys Perez. Gladys Perez.
But your point is well taken. Clearly, light-skinned blacks were valued because they resembled the very people who were subjugating them. In the first phase, the writers are trying to prove to essentially their subjugators that they are just as good as their subjugators. And that means adapting the value system of their subjugators. Yes?
But then that means that only, if they're just as good as their subjugators, which is the white, then it means only the blacks that look nearly white.
Yes,
are
well,
just as good
that's the
as
whole
white.
point that we're making here.
But-
Yes.
But those that are somewhat less than nearly white, we're not as good as.
That's the entire point.
Well, that's the point.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, the question is pertinent, but I kind of like to move the presentation along, because we're not even getting toward the issue of family yet, and I want to sort of move that way.
Okay. Well, let me just say that the groundwork that I'm laying here, I think, is germane to the. Can you hear me? Because this mic doesn't seem really. Okay. The presentation I'm making here I think, is germane to understanding the fact of family. So you'll forgive me for taking a little more time here. The second phase is the phase where the black writer remembers who he is. So he turns to folklore. He remembers his African past. It's also what's called a pre-fighting phase. It's the phase that goes right up to the point of revolution. The works of the Harlem Renaissance, for instance, on this particular phase, where they look back towards Africa. They look towards the common man. The next phase is the revolutionary phase. In the revolutionary phase, the oppressed person tries to he opposes the values that that the subjugator had totally. The works of George Jackson, as an example, of Eldridge Cleaver, were good examples of these. And finally, there's what I call the fourth phase, a phase beyond revolution, in which the writer has as his goal of creating first of all, the fourth phase is the phase in which the image of the authentic self becomes liberated. And the writer has as his goal of creating value structure for the group out of which he comes. In this case, the black writer has an obligation to create a sense of identity out of the experience that he's had. And a sense of identity which is a bond of freedom between the reader and the writer himself. Okay, let me stop here for just a second and ask if there are questions before we begin talking about the black family. First of all, I just want to pose a question. What do we mean by humiliated consciousness? How does this humiliated consciousness express itself in literature?
I think it's like somebody answered before, humiliated consciousness is see as the object of criticism or inferiority, and in black literature, you're trying to say that you're not, and you're trying to prove that you're not, and like a lot of people who read the book sort of elevate themselves mentally from being subjugated.
Okay. In other words, to put it in as plain English as possible, if you remember in the 60s, Martin Luther King said, I am, or was it Jesse Jackson, I am somebody. This was not immediately evident to everybody during that period. And it's in part the responsibility of the black writer to liberate that sense of self that feels itself worthy of something. That the experience of slavery is experience of total worthlessness. The word that I despise, the word nigger, implies a non-entity. And from that point, the black writer's function is to liberate the sense of worth. Is that clear? Yes, go ahead. Yes, I would say, and I'd say that's true always of any subjugator-subjugated relationship. All right, I want to move on now to a discussion about black literature, because it's my contention that we see these same patterns in black literature emerging, and I'm going to be as brief as possible. First of all, I would like to say that it seems to me that the relationship between any oppressor, any subjugator, and any group that is subjugated is essentially a pathological relationship. What do I mean by that?
Sick relationship.
Yes, that's exactly right. It's a sick relationship. It's a sick relationship because the people who generally subjugate other people are people who themselves feel inferior in some way, normally. And their attempt to subjugate other people is to have people to try to escape their own sense of inferiority by the subjugation of others. We see that in the relationship with the Nazis, who developed after a sense of total humiliation after World War I, this idea of the master race. We see it in the case of South Africans who have very few rights. We see it in the case here in the United States of in the Deep South, in Georgia specifically, people were let out of jail to settle that area. They had no rights themselves. As they began to gain rights themselves, they began to be very strict on blacks and on slaves in particular. So that what we have is a pathological relationship. And this pathological relationship obviously finds itself into the literature of black Americans. The function of literature, one would have to say, if my system before was correct, is to move from this pathology to a sense of harmony and a sense of the black family as expressing the kind of values that its freed artists would wish it to. And so, in the very first phase, does everybody understand what we're talking about here? Does everybody understand what we say when we say that the relationship between the subjugator, in this case the Southerners in the South, and the slave, and even the freed slave, was essentially a sick relationship, a pathological relationship. So if my system was correct in the first place, then it should express itself here. In the first phase, the same phases exist. In the first phase, when we're talking about the black family, we see a particular literature in which the family is presented along the lines of the model of the subjugator, in this case, the Caucasian society. There's a story, again in Chestnut, called Uncle Wellington's Wife, and this particular story is about a man who goes out to get wood for his wife. He has no sense of worth. He doesn't have really a job, and he decides that he's going to keep on going, so he goes north. He finds a Caucasian wife. He gets a menial job as and a nice a decent apartment for him. And in other words, he's able to change his condition. But the way in which he changed his condition was what? How did he change his condition here? Well, not just a Caucasian wife, a whole lifestyle that he associates with him. I'm sorry. Well, suddenly the wife becomes a symbol of that. Absolutely, wife becomes a symbol of that. But I think the overall point is that he wants to change places. Actually, as it turns out, he goes back to his other wife because everything goes bust for him. That's the way it goes. In the second phase, we talked about it being the pre-fighting phase. Most of the literature, the black literature that deals with the family, really deals with this particular phase. We have here the two works in particular, but we can say hundreds of a lot of different works here. But particularly Native Son by Richard Wright and James Baldwin. James Baldwin's Go Tell on the Mountain. In Native Son, we see really the pathology of the black family in full evidence. And does everybody know the story of Native Son about Bigger Thomas? In this particular work, you will remember, the Bigger lives in a rat-infested house. The very first scene is of a rat. And the genius of Richard Wright is that he made the owner of that apartment the landlord, the person who later hired Bigger, and Bigger actually kills his daughter. Why does Wright do that? What's the point of making that kind of relationship? Don't everybody shout at one time there. Why does Wright have the Bigger Thomas kill the Dalton's daughter? Yes. Don't be afraid. Huh? But he doesn't really kill her intentionally, actually. He kills her out of a deep sense of fear. That he has in fact become so conditioned by this particular pathological relationship between oppressor and oppressed, that it's a natural response when he's caught in this woman's bedroom to try to kill her. But the genius again is to have the Dalton the owner of the actual apartment, the person whose daughter he kills, because Dalton is indirectly responsible for his own daughter's death. That's the point that Richard Wright is making here. The relationship, the pathological relationship in which Bigger Thomas lives, is the relationship that has about it always the possibility of violence, that either he could kill himself or somebody else. James Baldwin makes another, I think, more interesting point, and that is that it is possible for the black family to live together, but not necessarily in harmony during the phase that Baldwin is talking about. That through strong-willed people, all the characters in Go Tell on the Mountain are extremely strong-willed. The young man John, who's Baldwin's surrogate, the father, who's a preacher, the sister Florence, all these people are extremely strong-willed, oppose each other and have many conflicts, but they remain together as a family. So they escape their pathology through an act of will, essentially. It doesn't mean that they have a harmonious relationship, although it ends, Go Tell on the Mountain ends with the suggestion that all will find a certain amount of peace. And Baldwin did in his life make peace with his family. It's interesting that in terms of the third phase, the revolutionary phase, I can't think of a single work that expresses the values of revolutionary values. I don't know if anybody else can. There's no other, I can't think of one work that deals with the family, the nuclear family, as from a revolutionary posture. It's almost as though black writers had decided that in terms of renouncing everything, in the same way that they renounced classical education, that the nuclear family belonged to those things that they viewed as essentially a part of Caucasian culture. I see no other particular explanation for it. That brings us to the fourth phase, and I should say about this phase that the writers of this particular phase are just emerging. We're in a period now, because the fourth phase is the phase in which we have the liberation of that buried, humiliated self. We find the real personality in this particular phase, the authentic self. And I think we're just now at a point in which black writers can begin to talk about this. And there are not a whole lot of examples that I personally would credit. I think that in Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, we began to have a sense of, and let me say about this, that when we talk about what we mean by a liberated literature, to my mind, I pose this in the form of a question first. What do we mean by a free people? Or a free individual? Well, or you're just equal, not even in reference to other people. But what I had in mind is that you have the freedom to create a sense of goals for yourself, and then the means and the freedom to pursue those goals. That I think is what we mean by a free individual. And in this case, then, we would expect to see the creation of a particular value structure of the black family created by black writers towards goals that are their own. And I want to say just one more thing about this, that if in this phase a writer is able to create that particular image of the black family, a liberated image, in which free people, free readers will look at that image and see a sense of their freedom, it has to be in the sense of what I call the particular universal. Does anybody in my class remember what we mean by that term? The particular universal. Again, a kind of complicated term, but what it means essentially is if I create an image of the black family that is a true image, that this image will also be universal. Families who are not blacks will be able to relate to that and see a lot of themselves in that. I'm going to talk about the Bill Cosby show just very briefly as an expression of that. In any case, The Bluest Eye, I think, comes at times very close to this, because she talks about, Toni Morrison talks about the particular family of an 11-year-old girl, Claudia, in terms that do not have reference to Caucasian society. It is self-contained, and we're dealing with the experience of this particular girl. In this story also are the Breedloves, who are an oppressed family, and who become kind of a metaphor or an example of the underclass. Beyond this, there are other books, but I don't think we have to enumerate. I just wanted to say a couple of other things about this, and that is that we do have examples. I think it's up to the black writer to create these images for us, but we do have examples, particularly in the Third World. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the work 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Marquez. I strongly suggest you read it, because here's a third world person that has given us a real vision of what third world literature can be like. It's a very brilliant novel. And also, as I mentioned, I think the Bill Cosby Show, which is not literature, I don't advocate this as high art, and I'm not saying that it is, but I think the value of Bill Cosby, and I don't watch television very much either, or this particular show often, but I think the value of this program is that it gives Bill Cosby's conception of what a black family should be, and this is done without any reference towards the suffering that blacks have done at the hands of Caucasians. I think which I feel is kind of reverting back to an earlier phase. I should say finally also that in ending this, I feel kind of obligated, because I know that that there's certain works like The Color Purple which get a great deal of attention in this regard. And to my mind, a work like this, while I happen to admire Alice Walker as a poetess and think she's extremely competent, I think that first of all, how many of you are familiar with The Color Purple? I think that, and we've had a lot of discussions like this over the years in my classes, but I think that a work like this, first of all, when a person writes a work, that particular work is a model of the way that they see the universe. Each character represents an idealized human being. So that when she talks about the black male as being either incestuous rapists or wife beaters, it is presenting a universal image, whether she intends for that to be the case or not. And we have very few images in that work to counteract that. And secondly, I think that there's very little question that this is the case, because you remember that in this particular work, we find that Pa, or the father, is not her real father. Her real father is really not a working class guy at all, but a person of far superior being to her father. And all she talks about Africans as sitting around letting their wives do the work, and comparing black Americans to them. I think clearly this is not a very positive image. And in any case, certainly does not express the fourth phase. What that phase will ultimately, the works that will ultimately emerge from that, well, we wait to see. Perhaps some of you, certainly the emerging writers, will produce those images. Perhaps Professor Gillard and Professor Bandelli will be able to address themselves to that.
All right, thank you. I will ask, we're going to try to speed things on just a little bit. So I'll ask you to hold your questions at this point until after Sister Mandela's presentation. You want to change seats? Yeah, do.
I want it.
Do you want to just stand? Or
Yeah.
You want to sit and stand it up?
Then you're going to need the mic.
Can I just go right here?
No, whatever.
Feel so restricted. All right. Okay, thanks. First of all, I'll give this my all, but my mind is on my son who's sick, and I want to finish the. I'm going to talk about images of the black family in literature, and Professor Steve Cannon, I want to give a special hello to, and appreciation for his work of a decade or more in the humanities division. I'm going to talk specifically about books and titles, so I might go kind of fast, but if you hear a book or a title, write it down. You might have heard of it, you might not have heard of it. In order to talk about images of the black family in literature, it's necessary to consider the image reality of black life in America as a dialectic of oppression, degradation versus resistance and freedom. Dialectic meaning opposing trends. That is, to study the black family in slavery, historian Barbara O'Malley offers us this, and I quote, "From the beginning, slaves, the socially dead, captive African men and fathers, women and mothers, took in all that the slave master and hypocritical system put on them, whippings, torture, and unrelenting toil. Yet they turned it around to work for themselves and their progeny. Language, religion, law, and family became African Americanized tools and weapons which slaves used to hone their humanity. In spite of restrictions on marriage and family, from the beginning, slaves constructed both, end of quote. Slaves constructed both families and marriage. This legacy has not changed in any great degree over the centuries. Within the framework of three principles which shape the general American family, I'll talk about some literature. And then we can place the historical and contemporary black family in literature within this framework. These principles, according to our brother Orlando Patterson, include: one, the puritanical tradition which condemned fornication with the threat of brimstone and fire. This is a principle which indicates the development of the American family. Second principle is a highly developed sense of racial purity, and this is most obvious in the literature of the 60s. The third principle is a strong moral commitment to a patriarchal family life, and patriarchal means male-dominated, male-controlled. These principles then are reflected in the literature, they are reflected in our lives. In these remarks, I am not considering images of the black family in literature written by non-blacks. That's not my interest, it's somebody else's. So in the literature written by blacks during the slavery period, during Reconstruction, during the Depression, during the Industrial Revolution and Civil Rights era, and contemporary USA, these three principles continue to undergird black family life. Again, these are the puritanical, the racial purity emphasis, and the patriarchal family. However, contemporary literature, especially that written by black women on the black family, has expanded that definition and added another undergirding principle, and that is the affirmation of the single parent, female head of household. And my remarks include significant discussion of this family type formation because it exists in literature, it exists in life, it exists among women in this room who are heads of their household. Now, structurally related to the single parent family is that most obvious of the African retentions in terms of family and communalism, and that is the extended family, the kinship network. Now, that's not to romanticize Africa, either pre-colonial Africa, because it was a country in struggle. It's not to romanticize it, but to say that the extended family, the kinship network, is an African retention that continues to sustain us, continues to get us over. And that simply says that, your cousin, who is your cousin, not because it's your mother's relative or your father's, but because your mother raised her or your grandmother raised her, so therefore it's cousin. That kind of kinship network, which may be blood, which may not be blood. Also, to frame the discussion, I want to share some findings from the United Nations regarding families in the world. When the United Nations surveyed families in the world in 1985, they said there are three factors which impact on the development and how families in the world look in 1985, in fact. These factors are, number one, war, number two, migration, and number three, divorce. Now, what becomes readily apparent is that these factors help to explain black family life from the time of our kidnapping: war, migration, and divorce, though it might have been called something else. That is, the fact of slavery certainly has an analogy to the fact of war. That is, and today, some black folks consider themselves part of a black liberation army, which extends it even further, being soldiers. So migration, post-slavery, and against the war against blacks in the United States. We can witness the hysteria surrounding immigration policies to get a sense of how migration is a factor. That is, who is moving from one part of the world to the next? Why are they moving? What are the economic underpinnings? And what happens to the family as a result of migration? What explains it? Well, the literature addresses it, has always addressed it. So we'll consider these three things along with the Patterson principles on family development as we look at some black literature and how it portrays the black family. Now to the images. Let us begin with the image, which is the reality, in Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And I'm pretty sure that all of the books I've mentioned are on sale in our bookstore, so you should check them out. Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Truth no more stranger than fiction. What describes this family structure? Has anybody read that book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl? What describes this family structure, this family life? So when we look at what happened to her, discussion of a black patriarchy pales besides the terroristic milieu in which this family operated. It was a terroristic milieu, surroundings, environment in which this woman had to operate with her family. But it's an extended family. It is a single-headed household trying to live, trying to survive in America. Years later, Margaret Walker's Virey in Jubilee wants to marry her sweetheart, the black, handsome, beautiful, and most importantly, free man, Randall Ware. Through the forced migration, again, migration as a factor impacting on family development, forced migration as a result of this, Virey despairs of meeting up with Randall and marries Ennis Brown. She does so after her owner attempts to dissuade her by asking, "So you want to be black and free? Why, my God, that's just like being a hunted animal running all the time," end of quote. And so it often was. But Virey and Ennis make their family. They make their marriage. They struggle like so many couples before them, after them, and today, to live, to love, to work, and to struggle together for themselves, their children, and their community. As she says, quote, "There was no question about it. My life is bound up with this black man's life as tightly as the slave owner had claimed my life for his own," end of quote. Next, to leap in time a bit, two significant pieces of literature dramatically demonstrated both the three factors of war, migration, and divorce, and Patterson's puritanicalism, race purity, and patriarchy. These are Richard Wright's Native Son, and Professor Loftus talked about that, and Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. In Native Son, racial purity may be equated with black manhood, and as such, the search for it and the result was swift and deadly. The problems of the black patriarch also stand out starkly. The issue, as is always the patriarch issue, power and dominance, white power and dominance versus would-be black power and would-be black dominance. So that family interrelationships in this war actually become secondary. The focus is Bigger Thomas's fight in this war, and issues of forced migration and the puritanical are also present. Janie in Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God comes out of the family, comes outside the patriarch. She's the single head of household, and her grandmother can only advise her to marry for security, but to marry. And it is Janie's yearning to escape the element of puritanicalism with its curbs and strictures that leads to the sensually wholesome marriage to her husband Tea Cake, though that ends tragically. Moving through time, the literature of the 60s, especially the poetry, presented an abundance of images stressing race purity. Black is beautiful, even as intra and inter family relations tense from internal and external burdens. Three plays come to mind as examples of this. Number one, James Baldwin's The Amen Corner. Two, Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun. And three, Lon Elder's Ceremonies in Dark Old Men. Certainly the moral commitment to strong family, to race pride is strong. Today, the Broadway play Fences by August Wilson appears to fit this mode. Lon Elder, by the way, is one of the panelists for the Images of Family segment, which I'll be moderating at the conference, and I'm sure everybody will be there. Eugene Redmond is also on that panel. Eugene Redmond's 60s, 70s, and perhaps even today's poetry reflects a clear love for and understanding of black families as units of struggle. His poetry, in my opinion, magnificently appreciates black men and black women and black children. Such appreciation in all of its profound complexities abound in images of the black family as portrayed by black women writers. Breaking New Ground or Plowing Up Old, this literature rejects the puritanical, the race purity, and the patriarchy, though often at times it paradoxically seems to embrace all three. Most obviously, it embraces the African extended family, the kinship network, and that element of spirituality, black women's spirituality. Witness these examples from the diaspora. the African continent, where Abuchi and Macheta, a Nigerian, moves from patriarchy to single head of households with Joys of Motherhood and The Bride Price. In her novels, the elements of war, migration, and divorce are clear. Witness Trinidad, where Merle Hodges' book Crick Crack Monkey, with all of its class antagonisms, is presided over by single head of household Tanti, about whom it was said, and I quote, "When she gave someone a piece of her mind, it could be heard 6 houses away," end of quote. Witness Shirley Ann Williams' Dessa Rose. What do we make of this black woman moving around with a white girl? Again, the black family breaking new ground. And Toni Morrison's beloved, single heads of households, Seth and Grandma Baby, are like many black women today, heading families, doing the best they can by themselves and for themselves and the children. Most importantly, living, experiencing that element of spirituality that is the antithesis of the puritanical and patriarchy. If it is a matriarchy, it is life-sustaining rather than life-robbing. As single heads of households, these families in literature are similar to others on the literary landscape. Again, the complexity enriches it. For example, Paul Marshall's A.B. Johnson in Praise Song for the Widow had an intact nuclear family, a marriage to Jerome Johnson. But it was only after Jerome Johnson died and A.B. became a widow that she, in fact, became a woman. There is also the nuclear family in Morrison's The Bluest Eye, and Professor Loftus talked about that. That's an intact nuclear family with mommy, Pauline Breedlove, daddy, Charlie Breedlove, daughter, Piccola, and son, Sammy. But like many nuclear families, this was nuclear, as in bomb, as in explodes. And I have a poem about this. Likewise, Morrison's Nell Wright's in Sula, Nell Wright wants a stable marriage, which she has for a while, with Jude, her husband, who would have left even if Sula had not seduced him. Jude, who paradoxically says about Sula that he could see why she wasn't married, because, quote, she stirred a man's mind, but not his body, end of quote. Then examining single heads of household as the family structure in Gloria Nayler's Women of Brewster Place, quite simply they abound. The sexless matriarch Mattie Michael, the sexy mama Etta Mae Johnson, the militant Kiswana Brown, the self-hating Luciella Louise Turner, the baby-loving, doll-loving Cora Lee, and the 2 lesbians Lorraine and Teresa. All of these families are in our communities. All of these families are in our lives. All of these families are our realities. All of these families are in our literature. The issue of the black family structure characterized by women-headed households is not new. Again, Barbara Omalade, historian, writes, "For nearly a century, the public discourse on black family life has been filled with distortions and omissions, prejudices and moralism. Though most of the discourse has focused on the junkies and the geniuses of black life, the lives of most black men, women, and children are quite normal, in spite of poverty, sexism, and racism. Because more black women than white women have headed their households and worked for wages outside of their home, social scientists and policymakers have almost always pointed out the deficiencies of these families by focusing on problem families. Thus, the emphasis on problem families obscures the reality of normal, functioning families, such as those headed by myself and headed by women in this room. Portrayals of the black family today, again, especially in novels by black women, reflect this positive reality, this positive experience, which is in fact a liberating experience. Finally, the richness of the diversity in black family portrayal in literature should be welcomed and praised, and we need to expand the examples that we always give. For Professor Loftus gave many examples of men as geniuses who write well. I counted them, which is what I always do, how many men are mentioned and how many women. So we consciously began to expand that in terms of who is writing and what it means. So we welcome the family according to Alice Walker, or the family according to John Edgar Whiteman, who writes of the male culture, but writes in a beautiful, magnificent way. In conclusion, as black family life continues to be subjected to the structures and strictures of this society, in this political economy, Black men and black women continue to make families, to live, love, and work together. And while rumors of the death of black people are premature, it is past time to ask, what works best for the race? Is there a structure that upholds the dignity and worth of each member of that family, from the eldest to the youngest, where issues of power, control, dominance within the household get no place, have no place, where there exists a circle of love and not a pyramid of oppression? Literature continues to hold up a mirror, to say in our ear, according to author Toni Cade Bambara's grandmother, act like you got some sense. Or, like Toni Cade Bambara's healer in The Salt Eaters, do you really want to be healed? Do you really want to not be sick? And I want to close with the poem I wrote about how difficult it is to be healed and whole, to have families in America. And this is called Current Events or Notes from the War Zone. And these were all current events in the newspaper at the time I wrote this. Do you know what a .357 Magnum does to the face of a 3-year-old African man-child? How hardly any face is left or body? How tissues and cerebral medulla cling to the wall near his little bed, in the living room, in that apartment building on Crown Street near Medgar College? How the gun blast leaves one baby eye hanging by a bloody thread, leaves one baby's young mama catatonic with grievous guilt, leaves one black male crackhead wondering what he's done, crack crazed, they said. But what about Barbara's husband? Wasn't on no crack, hardly drank any alcohol. No, cold, sober, with his .357 Magnum, firing 6 times at close range into Barbara's face and chest because he felt she no longer loved him and might want a divorce. Nah, wasn't no crack here. Was that particular mean, deadly violence that comes out of a particularly mean, deadly U.S. society. So you and your sisters think you something. Well, I'll follow you to and from work and kill you and your sisters right on the subway platform. And he did, tried to. Victims of failed reconciliation. These are current events from the war zone where their soldiers in blue falsely arrest 214 black and Latino men. Soldiers in blue telling lies about the brothers filling up on some white girls. And the white girls substantiate the lie on the brothers. The brothers be innocent, but they plea bargain because this is the war zone, and their army is winning so far. And our troops, like young black mothers, are strong. They have and keep their babies, while Mitchell Steinberg's young mama gave him up to a good Catholic family, or so she thought. After she and her mama hid the pregnancy from her daddy in this intact family, this nuclear family, nuclear as in bomb. Now Mitchell's mama is a darling, and the media falls in love with her whiteness and brunetteness, while young black mothers are vilified, crucified, rebuked, and scorned. And we grieve for young Lisa, as we grieve for little persons all over the world who are truly victims because they do not survive. And no one claimed the body of the black baby found in a Harlem litter-strewn clearing, scaring folks away, scaring even the crackheads away. Oh God, a dead baby, let me get out of here. And that Medgar College student who was strangled to death in July of 1985 by a still unknown man who probably wanted some, and she wanted something else, like her life. So what's a mother to do? Life not only ain't been no crystal stair, it's sometimes been no stair at all. Calling for making a way out of no way. That's our way. What's a mother to do? Well, one way is the mother love way. Mother love, one word. Mother love, one word, is different from ordinary a mother's love. A mother's love is cautious. Mother love says straight ahead, regardless. A mother's love asks, is it proper? Mother love asks, is it the truth? A mother's love is passively sweet. Mother love loves and kills with equal passion. Warm, sliced bread, warm, sliced throat. Mother love looks at these current events in the war zone, looks at dead babies, dead victims of failed reconciliation, raped daughters, cracked sons. Mother love regards the current, artificial, non-human scenes and takes a stand, or writes a poem. Says, I only have one life and one death. Let me make it count in this war. Let that be the most current event from this side of the war zone.
you have it, or do you? I want to swing it open now for questions. I know some of you are just itching. Huh? No. I know some of you are just itching to ask questions, right? Yes.
Bandelli, right?
Fantastic, yeah. In addition to always having a problem, all of us got problems. I got a problem. I mean, I'm following, ethnic distortion. My hands are so long. When I come to a dough, I can say dough. I have to back off the dough. That's typical of the past period. But specifically, they always say we got problems, no matter what we do. You succeed, you had a problem. That's one. The next phase is what I'm thinking about is labeling the African male or the African American male as a criminal. You understand what I'm saying? Walk forward. I happen to have been in the elevator coming up, and I was Jewish cousins were coming up. I just put Jewish cousins. Well, not saying where they got their culture from me. And the question is that listen, they all look nice, but you can never tell. So I thought, look nice. I said, am I any more criminal than my good Israeli cousins and the Gaza?
That's right. That's right, absolutely.
All right, next question or comment?
You understand what I'm talking about? That's what I want to say.
Absolutely.
Gentleman with the pen, I know you were itching to ask some questions. As were Sister in the hat right here in the gray hat, you wanted to ask questions earlier?
Based on the poem, I would like to ask Dr. Lawson, what phase is that?
Good question.
You put him on the spot here. Well, I would always have to answer honestly, actually. And I think that, well, let's just say that I think that this poem is, it seems to me, an outgrowth of certain works that were done in the 60s. Again, this is a very difficult question because I think that there's a basic disagreement here.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when she says, as an example, if I can just bring this up, when she says that the extended family is, that we're kind of fine as we are, I don't happen to think that.
I'm sorry, say it again.
The extended family, you suggested that we're fine, during your lecture, that the family is fine as it is, and that we're fine as we are.
No. I said that helps to sustain us, the extended family concept.
No, I didn't mean the extended family. Well, I mean the single
Oh, the
family.
single. Oh.
Yeah, and you mentioned that several times that the nuclear family was like nuclear war, etc. A nuclear bomb. Well,
half
yes.
of them, 50% of all marriages explode. On the truth.
Yes, but it seems to me that doesn't take in, several things that you said didn't take into consideration reality. And the reality is that this particular structure, first of all, the choice of having a single family was an outgrowth of a particular relationship between blacks who could not find jobs, that is, oppressed people, humiliated people, and their spouses. I don't think it was a natural relationship. So it seems difficult to affirm that relationship.
To affirm single heads of household?
As an ideal is different.
No, not ideal, because
Excuse me.
ideal is to have two incomes, and a fool knows two incomes are better than one. But what we're talking about is this phenomenon that's a result of many factors, which has resulted in half of black families being headed by women. And what I'm saying is that we have to affirm these families. Don't call them pathological. Don't say the children are going to be addicts, juvenile delinquents. Affirm the families. And what I'm saying is
But
that
how can you affirm the family without affirming? I mean, you can say yes that women. My mother, example, raised me. You can say, you can say that single families have done heroic things in terms of the structure. that they've had to live by, but to look at that as some kind of ideal.
No, the reality,
is,
not ideal, it's what exists.
Yes, but it exists for a particular historical reason, and to ignore that, it means that you can't even begin to change it.
Many
Yes.
people don't want to change.
That's the whole point that I'm making. To think that what we have now is as good as we can have, I think is absolutely
Yeah, okay,
intellectually wrong.
No, we'll never agree if you're going to say.
I know.
Whether that's absolutely what you said or not. I got from it that one parent family or female headed family started historically with slavery.
With slavery.
Okay. I also got that, not that she's saying that it's the ideal. I got what I got. That give it recognition and freedom. In other words, a single-headed one-parent family does not always spawn a drug addict or a criminal. It spawns other people. Many of us here in this room.
Yes,
who
but
are not criminals and drug addicts.
I don't think anybody would suggest that that's the case. But the fact, but let me just finish. The fact that people have survived does not alter the fact of the original structure of the relationship, or the intention of Caucasians in creating the kind of structure that they do. Still not. I mean, to this day, you can the things that I'm talking about, you can talk about today. That there's still situations and black men still are not allowed to have the same kind of jobs.
Absolutely.
The unemployment rate of young black males is over 50%. It's a disgrace.
Right.
And so, and not to see that as a
It's
pattern,
a factor.
not just a factor, but a pattern of established culture, is not to be able to change that culture and address ourselves to the needs that have to be done. I mean, it's all well and good to have feelings and emotions, but one has to see intellectually what the pattern is and be able to change it.
Always do that.
The gentleman in the blue sweater, and then the one in the back right here. I knew this was liven up. So.
Again, my mother raised me, and I don't think I turned out too badly. But I think that what my mother had to go through was unnecessary, and I think that if one survives under that circumstance, it's not exactly a miracle, but it takes enormous. One shouldn't have to do it.
Right.
And I think that one should not look on that as any kind of. I mean, you can say yes. Women and men who have had to do it were heroic, but that is certainly not to affirm the fact that that's the way things should be, because it means then that one does not have to then even try to change the system as it is. It means kind of a passive acceptance of the way things are, and I think that's absolutely incorrect.
All right, we have the gentleman with the glasses in the back.
Sophia Bandelli. I said that there have been the single parent formation among our communities since our days of slavery, that single parent formation has always been with us. Now, what do we do about the single parents, single heads of households who are within our families? What do we do about them? Is it a problem? It's an economic and political problem, because for black people, there is the systematic incarceration of black men in the homeless shelters. You look at the police murders. It's a problem. Of course it's a problem. But the thing is, while it's a problem, how are we working on it? We don't work on it by attacking that woman who's doing her best. We don't work on it that way.
Yes, we had
Yeah,
one.
okay.
The other gentleman. Yes.
I'm sorry, what?
double had another double, you know,
Two-parent.
two-parent, another single parent, and another child. Not always go to, you know, unemployment or whatever.
Well, that may be true, but I think there's no question about the fact that the structure of the society as it is presently structured influences a great deal, even how two people get along together. I mean, when there's not money in a household, as an example, that often breaks up relationships. And I mean, one has to just take these things into consideration. That it is not, it certainly is not a question of not giving people their due, or women their due, because I think that would be silly. But it is, again, a question of addressing oneself to the reality of the situation, political reality, and so that one can do something about it. If one says again that that things are more or less all right, or that people are striving, then that means that it doesn't really. Let me give you an example. The color purple, I think, is a good example. Well, you don't have to respond to it, but I do want to say that, and I won't even talk about the book. I would say that the reason The Color Purple, whatever one thinks about the book, the reason why it was so popular is because it talks about a pathological situation where you have incestuous rapists, and does not talk at all about the fact of, let's assume that that's the case. Is that not shaped in some measure by the fact that these people are brought up from a post-slavery condition? I mean, so to not to look at the structure of these things just doesn't seem to me very realistic. And it means that a person can look at The Color Purple, Caucasian critics as an example, and praise the book because it talks in a very negative way about black males without talking about the source of it. Now, one can think it's a great work if one wants to, but it doesn't take into consideration certain realities.
Do we have over here on my left?
According to the book, Pedagogy of the Oppressor, it also states that people after a while takes on the identity or the image of the oppressor. Now, in one case, is this thought reflected in the works of black writers?
Well, that was my whole thesis. I'm sorry you missed it.
I think yeah.
Essentially what I said is that they develop a sense of humiliated consciousness, and the whole function of black literature is not to move from a point of not identifying, but to create one's own value structure as a free individual. Does that answer your question? Yes, go ahead.
I would say in the general society today, the emphasis is on making money, paper money, and excessive greed makers. If you got by the way, that's tough. That is. Pardon me, sir? But I'm wondering who's controlling the Japanese. To follow what I'm driving at. In other words, what is alluded to the Japanese may be a form of a extended arbitrage from the United States. Now, if I mention a particular group, then naturally everybody will say I'm against myself. Because since the Hebrew culture is one of the African cultures, where they got it from. You follow what I'm trying to say. But if I may be brief without, right, is that greed in the society has definitely impacted as a pathology, if you will, or as a sickness on those who don't exactly have the power to counteract it, except over periods of time. I think this session here is most essential. And as the women start to speak within the Afro-American community, the men must also speak. And when we speak, we have to speak about being positive, as you say, not necessarily going through the rigors of what do you call it? The rigors of depression, not having, and the whole negative psychic being.
Yeah.
Where is she, Tony? She's right about
Somebody, did you want to answer that?
If there are going to be more what? Single heads of household?
My question initially was, does it seem like we're heading into an era where people, out of choice, women that is, will look to head up single-headed families?
It's never been a thing where people look to head up single, you know.
I see a lot of stars doing that nowadays.
Well, stars can afford it, yeah.
Yes, different things.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. When it works, when it works. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, one more question, yes.
I read in the magazine that a lot of black women, they don't want to marry the black men because the black women, they're progressing more. And they feel that most of the men, they're in jail while they're criminals and they're not working. Or in the military, whatever. Give me a sword.
They are opposed.
No, but I read an article on that. You know, isn't that like, it's not what you were saying that most black women are ahead of household because
No, not most.
a lot of men are
Not most. Yeah. Statistics indicate half of black households in the U.S. are headed by women.
You also said that statistics indicate that 50% of the marriages are going to end in divorce. You just said trying to use a lot of
But
people.
they did it.
6 months?
I hope not.
That 50% is going to become once you get to the single family.
No, but other people always getting married. People always getting married.
People always get married.
Yeah, getting married. Yeah, getting married. What are we going to do about the dead babies? We want to talk about that? What are we going to do about the crackheads? Let's talk about that.
Well, if the woman don't want to marry the man, what do you want the man to do?
I would say, what are we going to do about the crackheads and the dead babies and the violence? What are we going to do about that? And the police murders. What are we going to do about that? Yeah, right.
Yeah, we're gonna.
I got you.
All right. Thank you, Sophia. We're gonna call. Is Yvonne in the back? Ty. Is Yvonne back there? It was a good presentation. It should be. Yeah. Yeah, come forward, please. Front and center. This is Yvonne Bennett. And we have well, someone else was supposed to do this. Okay.
But anyway, for those of you who don't know, this is Professor Yvonne Bennett. And for, how many years has he been at Medgar? Since 1972. How many years is that? That's a long time. Since 1972, she has been here at Medgar College in the library. And I know I've been here 10 years, and for all the years that I've been here, I've been here 11 years. For all of those years, she has coordinated Black History Month. And she does a tremendous job coordinating Black History Month. There's supposed to be a committee. The committee is kind of lackluster. Doesn't give her all the support, but this woman works hard. So we want to recognize her achievement, and this plaque, Taiwo from the bookstore really thought about this, and it was long overdue. Presented to Professor Yvonne Bennett, Chairperson, Medgar Evers College Black History Committee, with love, from Friends of Medgar Evers College Library, March 10, 1988, for her undying commitment to the upliftment of her race through the Medgar Evers College Library. And it's like a book. It's beautiful. And you deserve it. Thank you. Make a speech.
Yes, this will be a quick speech. You don't know, sometimes you think that everything is going to go, that everything is going to go by the wayside. That there are times when you can't do this because it's physically impossible, sometimes it's mentally impossible. But through the work with the colleagues that I have here at Medgar Evers College, it has really been worth it, I must say. And even though, yes, the committee does become kind of lackluster every now and then, but we have those who move, okay, and the movers and the shakers, if you will. We're the ones that really appreciate doing things for you, to let you know what kind of information is out here, to bring speakers and cultural events and creativity on various issues that impact upon you. Just open your eyes, open your ears, and open your minds. That's all that I ask of you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you all for coming.
Anytime we make a presentation about literature to an audience who's primarily concerned with not literature, they talk about sociology. It becomes a debate about what men should do, what women should do, who should marry whom, and what you do with kids.
Hi, how you doing?
How are you?
Okay.
You have an attendance sheet?
No.
You look very much like a reverend.
I do. Everybody tells me that.
Huh? Do you do that in your spare time?
No.
Oh. Well, you know I'm Alice.
No,
Spencer.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. So next week?
Next week, yes.
Am I to be prepared to bring in those paintings next week and present them to the class? When is that to?
We're going to begin next week. You know who was coordinating it? She's already gone. Oh, there she is.
Oh, yes. All right. Thank you.
Never that early, but you know.